Welcome to Industry Focus, the podcast that dives into a different sector of the stock market every day. Today is Tuesday, April 9th, and we're talking WWE. I'm your host, Nick Seipel, and today I'm joined in studio by Motley Fool contributor Dan Klein. Dan Klein, how you doing?
I don't know. Is now when I cut a 90-second promo about how I'm going to beat you?
Yeah, I mean, you could. You know, Dan might be turning heel today, folks.
Listen up, brother.
Yeah, we're talking about wrestling. Dan, WrestleMania just happened on Sunday. What was your takeaway from that event?
That no television show should be 5.5 hours long.
Yeah.
There were too many emotional peaks. So, like, usually at WrestleMania, you build to one underdog, finally has his day, holding the championship up. They had like 6 of those.
Yep.
So by the time they got to the main event, I was exhausted. Admittedly, I'd been watching most of it on my phone in a bar at the hotel I'm staying in, and then on my laptop in my hotel room, which is not the most pleasant way to watch television.
Yeah, Dan, I didn't quite get the full experience of WWE. I was in Montreal, Canada for a friend's bachelor party of the weekend. Did catch the last couple hours of the show. I tell you what, the Triple H Batista match I thought was incredible. Good job kind of working the different body parts and things like that. I thought it was a great example of good wrestling. Dan, today, you know, we're talking a little bit about WrestleMania, a little bit about wrestling. We both like that a lot, but we're going to talk about WWE as a business today,
probably should.
as well. And so first, off the top of the show, let's talk about just where they make their money. As many people will know, WWE is the premier global wrestling brand. You can consider them the NFL of professional wrestling. Where are they making their money? Where does most of their money come from as a business, Dan?
Television rights.
Yep.
So and this has been a huge question mark until very recently for WWE. They were always a difficult television property in that wrestling is considered a little downstream. WWE's done a good job getting mainstream advertisers to be willing to advertise, but that's kind of a recent thing. So for the last few cycles of TV rights before the current one, their deal would come up and they would only have one bidder. So Comcast would say, hey, yeah, we'll give you a little more, but there weren't. Now the rights world has exploded so much that Comcast is paying them basically what they used to pay for 5 hours of programming for just the 3-hour Monday night show. And Fox is paying them $1 billion over 5 years on top of that for their sort of number 2 show, which is actually going to be on network broadcast television.
Yeah, Dan, let's unpack a little. We'll talk a little bit later about the details around those TV deals. But just to start off, let's unpack a little bit about what rights we're selling. So WWE produces 5 hours of weekly original content. You mentioned they have 2 shows. They have Raw, which has been on.
So those are the A-list shows. The WWE actually produces all sorts of, let's call it curtain programming. The main event, which is a 1-hour show to just sort of get some of the talent on the card. They have NXT, which is their sort of like AAA territory. They have 205 Live, which is the lighter weight wrestlers who fly around more. Some of that's programming that's on their network. WWE Network is a paid subscription service. It was a hedge against what if nobody bid for one of these properties? Well, we could take it, put it on our own network, maybe add 1 million subscribers, keep the revenue in sort of the same place. And then they also have the TV revenue from their E deal and their USA deal for Ms. and Mrs., which is a reality show, Total Divas, Total Bellas, which are reality shows. Then there's the sort of like occasional tryout stuff. They've had cartoons. They had a Saturday morning kid show. They have different cuts of things for international. I don't know if they have a Hulu show still, but they used to have an edited version of Raw for Hulu.
They still have that.
They still have that.
Yeah.
So, but the bulk of their money is made from licensing Raw and SmackDown, the 2 A-list shows, not just in the U.S. The U.S. is the most important deal, but there's also huge money for them to be made in some of the major markets around the world.
Right. Dan, yeah, so you're exactly right. The media portion of the business, as we mentioned, is about 73% of their revenue. You mentioned the network aspect of the business. That's been an interesting phenomenon over the past several years. They launched that in 2014 and have transitioned from their old pay-per-view model to this more consistent, you pay $9.99 a month as a network subscriber, and you get all the pay-per-views each month.
So the premise of the network makes sense. But in some ways, there was a disconnect. So they looked at me and you, and they said, okay, you guys are wrestling fans, but you're only buying maybe WrestleMania, and like once a year, there's a pay-per-view that like, oh, I really want to see that. So you're spending $59.99 twice a year. That's $120. That's $9.99 a month. So the proposition was, I bet for $9.99 a month, Dan and Nick would want all the pay-per-views, all this archival content, some original shows we produce, some highlights, some documentary, all sorts of cool stuff. And actually, the answer has mostly been somehow that math doesn't compute to people because they thought they would have 2 million subscribers a year ago. They have about 1.3, 1.5. And that number goes down after WrestleMania season. And it hasn't been the global success they thought it would be, but there's a caveat to that. The second they signed these television deals, they, for 5 years, decided that the network would be downplayed, that they're not going to produce as much original programming there. They almost never mention the network on the television shows, which used to be like an endless refrain of $9.99 a month, because they don't need the network as much as they used to, and they have to make sure people watch their key shows or else those deals are going to go away.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of phenomenon how that fits into part of their business. It's something to watch going forward. As you said, it hasn't quite grown as much as the business would have liked. But when you've got, an audience of 1.5 million subscribers, you can kind of depend on month over month. Interesting part of the business. As we mentioned, Dan, the media is the biggest part of the business, over 70% of their revenue, and that's been growing over time as sports and sports-related media rights have been moving up over time. However, the rest of their revenue comes from producing live events as well as selling merchandise, and those haven't seen quite as much growth over the past few years. Have declined as a portion of revenue over the past several years. Live attendance over the past several quarters has been down in the mid-single-digit range. How should we think about those aspects of WWE's business and how it fits into the investment thesis of the company?
Wrestling tends to be cyclical. You have a breakout character like The Rock or Hulk Hogan, Stone Cold Steve Austin. And that drives merchandise sales, drives the business. It makes it cool because a fifth grader is not going to buy a wrestling T-shirt if it's not cool. So certainly an adult male is not wearing a wrestling T-shirt unless wrestling is very in vogue or we're very out of touch. So right now, the hot wrestling tends to be the smaller independent scene. I don't know if you've seen Bullet Club T-shirts out there. They're a New Japan wrestling faction. Chris Jericho, a very famous longtime WWE wrestler, is sort of on his own and working with a new group, has done really well selling shirts at Hot Topic, where some of the people wearing Chris Jericho shirts or Young Bucks shirts bought at Hot Topic have no idea that they're wrestlers. They might think they're bands or just logos or who knows what, but the cool factor isn't there. So WWE is going to be hurt by that. They're also hurt by their number one star in terms of mainstream appeal is John Cena. He sells an enormous amount of merchandise to kids. Well, he's barely active. He's a Hollywood movie star who comes back for big shows. So when there's an arena show, he's not on the show. So the kids aren't buying his hat and his sign and his T-shirt and his headband and probably his bobblehead doll and his ice cream and who the hell knows what else. But that's going to hurt merchandise sales. Maybe this pops back up because some of the women wrestlers are sort of having a creative peak, and maybe it becomes more cool for girls to wear Charlotte Flair or Becky Lynch or Ronda Rousey shirts, but that hasn't in any way been the case yet.
Yeah, Dan, and let's, since we mentioned it, let's talk about that a little bit. WWE has really tried to change their image when it comes to, how they treat women on the brand and how they're shown, on the content. And they've really, you mentioned the reality shows on E, which is, targeted toward that audience, as well as, WrestleMania on Sunday night. You had the first ever headliner, an all-women's headliner between Charlotte Flair, Becky Lynch, and Ronda Rousey. How has that strategy worked for WWE over time, and what does that mean for the business?
So WWE decided to go PG for advertising reasons. And there were two things that they got rid of to make that happen. Blood. If you're watching on Monday night and a wrestler has his head split open, it's live. They'll stop the match, have a doctor come out and either stop the match and call it a no contest like a real sport, or they will tape it up. And they do not have the old days in the 70s and 80s where you'd see like Ric Flair with a crimson face. The second thing they did is female wrestling in the 80s and 90s was eye candy. They weren't trained wrestlers. They were in skimpy outfits. They would have bikini contests. Now it is presented very much like the males. And certainly there are male wrestlers wearing skimpy outfits. I'm not going to wear trunks to do this show anytime soon, or even a singlet, frankly. So there's still, a little bit of that, but they are shown as real competitors. The WrestleMania main event was a brutal, hard-fought contest between people who are every bit as trained and talented as the top men. That is a huge change. That might not bring in a huge women audience, but it does make it so your girlfriend or my wife is going to be less like, oh, you're watching wrestling? Is it for the bikini contest? No, it's because it's a pseudo sport that I like the drama of.
Right, as well as it makes the brand much more palatable to advertisers. And
that was the impetus for it.
Right, and so let's go, Dan, now and talk a little bit about the TV deals that we've just got over the past year. The big news is Fox has bid and received the rights to SmackDown Live, which it will air on the Fox network on Friday nights, which is moving WWE wrestling from its traditional home on USA on basic cable to now a Friday night location on network TV. What's the significance of this deal for the company, and what can we gain? What insights can we gain from that deal as we look forward in the future of the business?
So, in the next 5 years, as an investor, it guarantees the company's going to make more money every year. It's an escalating deal. It's worth a little bit more every year. On the surface, it should be better exposure. Ratings have been slowly going in the wrong direction for both of the major shows. They're still huge draws for cable. But if SmackDown, which is the show that's moving to Fox on Friday nights, it's on Tuesday nights now. Tuesday is a better night than Friday. Fox is a much better home than USA. USA had top cable channel versus an actual broadcast network that is in pretty much every home that has television. In theory, that show should do a slightly bigger audience than it does now because of the better home, but also the worst night because young men are out on Friday nights. So if it's doing 2.1 million viewers, they're probably expecting 2.3, 2.4. If it settles in at 1.7 million, they're in real trouble. And it will get moved to FS1 because the reason this is taking up primetime real estate is it's 51 weeks of live programming a year versus the 4 sitcoms that aired in that block were each producing 18, 22, 23, whatever it is episodes. So you're running a lot of reruns, a lot of ridiculous filler programming. This should give you a loyal, marketable audience, a platform to promote NFL games, but anytime a wrestling show moves channels, it is a challenge. So we're going to have to see how Fox promotes this, and we're going to have to see just like how many wrestling fans are DVRing it and don't change their DVR. I'm fairly confident that the bigger platform and Fox sort of putting its weight behind this as a sports property will work. And even Raw on USA at twice the licensing fee or whatever the exact number is, that's going to have to maintain its 3.4 or 3.6 million people a week, consistently be one of the top cable shows because it's already a loss leader. Like they're not making money on that deal. They're using it to maintain their status as a top 5 cable channel. And that's good for selling ads elsewhere. So it's like paying for NFL programming. It's not so much about whether you make money on those shows. But when you take a lot of money for something, you better deliver or you're taking a big risk.
Yeah, I think that it's really significant. USA having the rights to Raw has really driven a dependable audience to them on Monday nights for a long period of time. It's kind of helped that channel, remain of significance. You talked about kind of the deepening relationship with Fox, and there's been some rumblings that there may be a new FS1 show led by WWE, which would indicate even more deeper relationships, more cross-promotion.
I'm fairly sure that's been confirmed, or at least it's that they're going to do some sort of, call it a news desk show. Now, the challenge with WWE, and we both have the WWE Network, and for a while they did after shows. So you could watch Talkin' Smack after SmackDown, and they tried to do like a talk show format where they were still their wrestling characters, but it was a little more real, and it's a very tough line. And when it worked, Daniel Bryan and The Miz, it was awesome. It felt like real life. It was really exciting. When it doesn't work, it feels like a guy playing a goofy wrestling character who doesn't realize he's on a talk show and he shouldn't be playing a goofy wrestling character. ESPN had a big challenge. Do you remember their SportsCenter segments?
Yeah, when they had Jonathan Coachman and he would have all the folks on there, and yeah.
And sometimes they'd be themselves, and sometimes they'd be their wrestling character. And from a reporting point of view, ESPN had the trouble of, do you report this as sport, or do you report this as like this is a real grudge between these two people, the way like a UFC fight would be portrayed? So that's going to be a challenge for FS1. I thought they would have been better off with like a highlight show or something like the WWE Network does, like Countdown, where it's like the 10 best wacky gimmicks of the 90s. Yep. But that's the first I think you're probably also going to see 205 Live, maybe NXT, maybe a third hour of SmackDown. Part of the goal of this is to eat up hours on FS1 because they lost UFC.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, Fox, the new Fox appears to be their strategy to be focused more on sports and news content. And this WWE offering would fit right in with what seems to be the focus of the business post the Disney transaction. Dan, one other TV rights thing I kind of want to get your thoughts on before we move on is India. So, from the numbers you gave me, rights in India are expected to jump from $24 million a year to around $125 million a year. Obviously, a significant bump up. When you look at the population in India and what opportunity that might give WWE to expand its audience, what are your thoughts on the potential for that and how that fits into the business strategy?
So they've been trying for years. They've had an India office, and it's interesting that they're viable as a television property, but they've never been viable as a touring property. They've done a show or two, but it's a sold show where they're getting a set amount of money, and it doesn't make sense to transport wrestlers all over the world for one show, no matter how, well, the Saudi Arabia shows being the exception because the money is so high. But they don't sell a lot of merchandise. They're not part of the culture. So it's an uphill battle. When you look at a market like Mexico or Japan that have their own wrestling traditions, there is a curiosity factor of the big American wrestling company. So when WWE does 2 shows in Japan every 8 months or whatever it is, those shows are going to sell really well just because it's the big version of something we already know. In India, this is not a known thing. So they really, it's a very long project. So the fact that they're getting this kind of TV money is a very strong sign.
Yeah, it's something to follow because obviously when you're a brand like WWE, as you can grow your audience, you really grow the potential to grow your network and just grow the interest in your brand over time. You talked about the events they've done in Saudi Arabia over the past year, and that kind of gets us to WWE has faced some criticism both for those events in Saudi Arabia as well as the most recent criticism we've seen on a widespread public basis is John Oliver on his show last week tonight profiled WWE. Actually, the night after or the day after his show, shares dipped almost 3%. On the news. Dan, what can you tell our listeners about John Oliver's arguments?
Let me explain the John Oliver piece. The WWE considers its wrestlers independent contractors, but not only does it completely control their schedule and their bookings and where they can wrestle. So if I'm a WWE wrestler, I cannot wrestle for another company. Well, that makes sense. I'm a Motley Fool contractor. My contract says I cannot write without permission for other competing entities. Now, if a local newspaper wanted me to write a story, I'd probably get permission. If a direct competitor wanted to, they'd probably say no. That part, WWE is probably okay. The secondary part is that WWE, if you say, hey, after the Monday Night Raw show, I'm doing stand-up comedy, WWE can say no to that. Hey, I got an offer to be on TV. Meh, we don't want you to do that. So they are straddling the line. They don't have the ability to say, you want me to work Monday night, but I'm taking Monday off. I can say, in fact, you can't even tell me what story to write. You can ask me if I want to write a story, but then it's totally my decision because I am truly an independent contractor. The WWE can say, Nick, you are a wrestler. You have to be there Wednesday night. You're going to work this schedule. You're going to pay for your own travel. So it's a gray area. They don't cover health insurance for the wrestlers. They do cover if you get hurt in the ring. They pay for that stuff. It is a traditionally giant expense, has why wrestlers have not been salaried employees. And at the top of the pay structure, that's irrelevant. If you're making $5 million a year, who cares how that check is coming in? But if you're a contracted guy in NXT making $35,000 a year, or you're a low-level WWE guy who makes $100 but has to pay his road expenses, these are big issues, and the company is flush with cash. John Oliver has every right to say that maybe they should make these people employees. The Saudi Arabia issue is a secondary one. They have a giant paid deal to stage major spectacle shows 2 a year in Saudi Arabia. And it is a $40 or $50 million. They don't quite break it out, but there's been sort of some backwards math that gets to those numbers. They throw all the stops at these shows. They bring out of retirement wrestlers. You'll see The Undertaker. You'll see Hulk Hogan. They will pay, last one they paid Chris Jericho when he was a free agent to go. But Saudi Arabia, as many of you know, has been in the news for humanitarian issues. And there has been, I'd call it minor brushback. I don't think the average WWE fans care. And they've straddled the line. they still do the shows, but they don't promote them on their sort of over the broadcast airwaves as much.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I'm a WWE Network subscriber. I like the product. I'll tell you, I did watch one of the Saudi Arabian events, and there was some stuff that felt very much like propaganda.
No, it is propaganda.
Yeah.
And they are running videos about how progressive the nation is on a show where their female wrestlers aren't allowed to wrestle, where they inadvertently showed a video that had some of the female personalities in it, and they got a lot of blowback on that. At least at the last show, Renee Young, the female commentator, was allowed to be at the desk. But it is a little hypocritical to be showing videos about, and maybe in that world, this is a very progressive country. I'm not super up on the politics, but it is definitely a dicey proposition,
right? And it's been controversial. You had some wrestlers who chose to opt out of that event,
and some who couldn't. Sami Zayn, because of his descent, wasn't welcome in Saudi Arabia. And when you have a country that's sort of dictating, hey, we don't want wrestlers who were born here, that is not sort of how the American investor looks at things.
Yeah, so definitely a problematic thing. I will say one thing before we move on the independent contractor side. A little bit of that is, the company probably doesn't want to pay more expenses than they have to, but part of it traces back to the history of wrestling. If you look at the legacy of wrestling before the WWE emerged, it was a regional, product that you had different regions that had different wrestling promotions, where you'd have folks like Ric Flair and Andre the Giant would move from promotion to promotion to promotion, kind of barnstorming across the country. But with the rise of WWE, in the late 80s into the 90s, all those regions were consolidated into what is WWE today. So the dynamics of the industry from the perspective of the wrestlers and who they can work for has really changed, but the relationship between the business when it comes to their employment status has not.
It's changing back, and we're not going to talk a lot about competition to WWE, but it's worth noting that there are now a handful of companies where wrestlers can make a legitimate living. So 10 years ago, it was high school gyms making $25 a night or WWE. Now there's AEW, a company being started by Tony and Shad Khan, who own the Jacksonville Jaguars, that have spent 7 figures to sign Chris Jericho and some of the biggest independent stars and Japanese stars. And they're taking an interesting approach. A lot of their top talent are employees, but they're also performing office jobs. Some of their, I don't want to say lower level talent, but like the less high up on the card, they have contracts that don't forbid them from working elsewhere. So there's a young wrestler, Maxwell Jacob Friedman, MJF, who is under AEW contract, but he also works on the indie scene. They have first priority on his dates. He might have rules about which TV he can work. So some of the younger companies, Ring of Honor takes that approach. New Japan, which is a Japanese program that has television in the US on Access TV. A lot of them are taking more we're going to let you do whatever makes sense for you as long as it doesn't impact us, but there's no reason for WWE to do that.
Right. And, we're seeing these new folks emerging. I think AEW is probably the most exciting, competitor to WWE now. They have big names that folks would be familiar with, like Chris Jericho, some big folks from the independent circuit. But I think for at least the past couple decades, since WCW kind of fell back, it's been WWE and then everybody else. You've seen a lot of these smaller organizations kind of have a Remora strategy where when WrestleMania is in town, we're going to have our biggest event of the year in the same town and those sorts of things.
Even that is very recent. Mm-hmm. When I was a kid, all these regional territories, the mid 80s existed, but they were struggling. What used to sell out 2 nights a week in Dallas and then play one night in Houston was now doing one night in Dallas to 300 people. But that all completely went away. And there were the 2 major companies. There was the occasional upshot third company. But now we're seeing an explosion of where there's probably 30 wrestling promotions in the United States where you can make a fair amount for a night's work, and there's 1 or 2 contracted guys that are making a decent living, and they're not working the sort of very difficult schedule. And that's good for the business, because imagine if television had to produce all these hours of, dramas and sitcoms, but there were no acting schools. Mm-hmm. So now, if you decide you want to be a wrestler, sure, if you're a big-time prospect, WWE signs you and puts you into their training system and you make it. But if you're not, you can sort of take the hard scrabble approach and go to a wrestling school and work for $20 a night and barnstorm around the country and sort of make a name for yourself.
Yeah, so we'll have to see how this competition plays out. It's kind of interesting to have the changing dynamics and that, the wrestling fan base is robust enough to support, this many promotions. But Dan, I want to transition now, as we kind of wrap up the show, talk a little bit about WWE's stock and where it's going to be going forward from today. So over the past 3 years, the shares are up more than five times. It's $900 million in total revenue, up 60% in the last 5 years. But if you look at their valuation metrics, they're trading at 80 times trailing earnings. What's kind of the future for this company? They're in the small wrestling niche, but they're deepening this relationship for Fox. How should investors think about this and where this company fits in?
So I think the valuation's a little high right now. I think it is priced in all the best things that are going to happen, which is the 5 years of the U.S. contract, the upside in some of the global contracts that are coming up. I think there are two things that could offset that. The commitment to women maybe creates a generation of younger girl fans that grow up as fans. And I do think we don't have a character, as we talked about earlier, that's breaking through to mainstream that's a full-time wrestler. If that happens, if somebody comes out of nowhere and becomes the next Stone Cold or The Rock and is there for 5 or 6 years, there's a lot of room. They're going to run a full house show schedule, whether they're selling 8,000 tickets or selling out. So there is room for a hot act to kind of drive the business. But and we've talked about this before personally, there is a huge thing hanging out there, is that it makes a lot of sense for Fox to buy the WWE.
Yep.
And they are taking a test run. But if you look, Vince McMahon, who is the creative guru behind all of this, is 73 years old. He has a wonderful wrestling management group behind him. Triple H, the famous wrestler who is married to his daughter, Stephanie McMahon, is proven himself with NXT, the developmental territory, that he understands how to sort of book and put together wrestling programs. He's built a staff under him that could kind of take over the wrestling side. If Fox could take over the business side, you could take a lot of expense away. And from a Fox point of view, would you rather pay $1 billion every 5 years or $6 billion now, or whatever the number would be to purchase it and just own it? We saw it with Viacom and Bellator. These, call it second-tier sports leagues that are somewhat affordable, should be purchased. You should just control your costs going forward and own it. And I think that will be a nice premium should it happen. Not that anyone has said it will, but I'm fairly confident that that's at least being thought about.
Sure. And all this is going to, at the end of the day, depend on Vince McMahon, the man who built the company over time, has been, the creative genius behind the company, has created these folks from Hulk Hogan to Stone Cold to The Rock to John Cena. He controls 80% of the voting power of the company, so he's going to decide where we're going.
He's also
forward.
Cashed out $400 million worth of stock to invest in the XFL, a football league that looks a lot more viable given that its chief competition went out of business. Now, you could say a spring league went out of business. That's not good. But that spring league demonstrated that there was an audience. It sort of set more of an ability to charge for television rights. And if Vince McMahon is saying, I'm willing to put $500 million in, we don't know exactly what the losses were for the AAF, but we know they weren't $500 million or even $250 in the first year. So he's set up to maybe transition himself into a new business, and it might make sense to have Fox in that role.
Right. It's to be determined how robust that move into the XFL will be. Just for context, Vince McMahon still owns over $2 billion in stock. But as you mentioned, when you have, the visionary leader of the company for its entire history, selling off shares of his stock, aging, as well as maybe having his attention distracted with other projects, does raise a little bit of a, smell.
I'm not telling him you use the word aging in association.
Yeah, Vince McMahon is 73 years old. He could probably still beat me up.
Without question.
All right, Dan, last thing I wanted to kind of talk about, we've seen over the past several years, and I think WWE can lump into that, sports rights really move up over time. And I think WWE's been riding that wave with this most recent sports deal. WWE is an investment. Do you have to believe that the broader arena of sports rights are going to continue moving up over time? So NFL, NBA, MLB, or do you think, the WWE can be successful in moving up its media rights without separate and apart from the rest of the sports?
So it's funny. Sure. Chris Hill and I talked about this on Market Foolery yesterday. I believe fully that there is not a bubble, that the looming presence of dumb money in the streaming space, DAZN might decide, hey, baseball isn't getting a big enough offer, fine, we'll triple their money. I think you might see a Sunday Ticket with the NFL move to a different platform, maybe staying also with DirecTV, but also being on ESPN Plus or someplace else. I think as long as you have one extra bidder, that the rights will keep going up. Amazon, Facebook, DAZN, ESPN Plus, maybe Netflix someday, maybe some billionaire that we haven't even thought of yet, or some of these fledgling services. You know, maybe when Time Warner launches its series, it decides it needs a top-tier sports property. I am not at all worried about sports rights.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how things play out. You know, you had the UFC deal with ESPN. It seems WAB could fit in a similar role there. Something we're going to continue to watch over time. And Dan, I'll be happy to have you on as we get more information. Thanks for coming on once again.
Looking forward to it.
As always, people on the program may own companies discussed on the show, and the Motley Fool may have formal recommendations for or against the stocks discussed. So don't buy or sell anything based solely on what you hear. Thanks to Austin Morgan for his work behind the glass. For Dan Klein, I'm Nick Seipel. Thanks for listening, and Fool on.